Welcome to Novelio. Today, we are going to kick off our first ever episode with our first ever novel. This new novel came out recently and it's written by Jessica Russell. I'm just going to go ahead and read about the author before I jump into Hot Winter Sun. Jessica Russell is the pen name of Jessie Broat, a professional web content writer who specializes in travel. Passionate about history, the author is an avid reader of both historical fiction and non-fiction history books. Throughout her life, she was inspired by authors such as Victoria Holt, Phyllis A. Whitney, and Belva Plain, and strives to create the same type of multi-dimensional, entertaining characters that readers can relate to, understand, and ultimately enjoy. Broat created her first novel-length work of fiction with Hot Winter Sun and laughingly calls it the kind of book you think no one writes anymore. A professional singer at one time, the author often refers to words as music of another kind and hopes they are felt that way by her readers. Broat lives in the southeastern United States with her husband and childhood sweetheart Dan, as well as Frosty and Snoodle, her faithful purring companions. She loves music, reading, traveling, and simply enjoying the sights and sounds of nature, and also has a blog for travel enthusiasts called Your Endless Holiday. So let's dive right in to Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. I'm going to read the prologue, and here we go. The distinct clopping of hooves sounded over the stony path at the blacksmith's shop, and 9-year-old Catherine Trefelner came running along the fence, as always excited to see the Bradshaw twins on their magnificent horses. "Who has lost a shoe now?" she said, attempting to sound businesslike, which greatly amused the twins, who were 20. "No one today, Miss Catherine," Robert said. "We just wonder if you could give this payment to your father for tending my sister's ailing horse last week." The girl looked thoughtful. "Well, why wonder if I could do it rather than just ask me to?" The twins looked at each other for a moment and suddenly burst into laughter. "When you laugh, you look like two princes," she said solemnly. "Well, thank you, Miss Catherine," Julian said, and the twins smiled at each other. Robert appeared to be searching for the envelope, and Julian said, "Don't tell me my sainted brother has forgotten the payment." "'Tis right here, Julian. Don't be so impatient." Looking thoughtful again, Catherine said, "I don't think either of you could be saints, though." "Why is that?" Julian asked, grinning at his brother. "Because my mother calls you two a pack of mischief, and I don't think mischievous people are very saintly." This resulted in more boisterous laughter from the twins. "But we can at least be princes, Miss Catherine?" Julian asked. "Yes," she confirmed with a serious look they both found amusing. "Good," Robert said. "Then when you're grown up, I can be your prince and marry you." At this, Catherine giggled, took the envelope, and ran back to her chores. "How many hearts do you think that one will break one day?" said Robert as the two rode off. "I shouldn't want to count that high, brother," Julian replied as they made their way back to the main path, still grinning. Adventure. Catherine felt the warmth of the late May sunshine as it fell over the small group of mourners clad in black and grey. She owned no proper mourning dress, but rather wore one which had belonged to her mother. "Put on a suitable garment," her father had shouted that morning, "and show proper grief." "It will not be a show for me, father. It is you who must falsify your grief." The sun was pleasant, but Catherine felt she would never be warm again. She could almost feel the cold bars of a cage falling down around her on all sides. If not for Robert and his love, what would be left for her now? She did have her older brother Christopher, as well as her younger siblings, but Christopher was far away in a world of uncertainty, and she felt ill-equipped to protect the younger ones, indefinitely without him. She watched stoically as the clods of earth fell upon her beloved mother's grave, and listened to the droning liturgy of the vicar. In the distance she heard a mockingbird sing a few notes and then pause, as if unhappy with what he had done. It's as if all nature knows something is wrong. Robert did not know her mother was gone. He was abroad and wouldn't return for several months. She loved him wholeheartedly and knew he loved her, but how could he go to his wealthy and revered family and tell them he intended to marry Catherine, a girl of no background, fortune, or standing in society? She was educated, and she had an excellent reputation in the village, but what would that mean to the lord of a large estate? Would Robert's inheritance be cut off? It was done, she knew. She heard of a couple who had stood out against the son's wealthy family in that very way and come to grief in penury. She couldn't bear the thought of her and Robert meeting such an end. But deep down she forced herself to believe all would be well. Their love had been strong from the beginning. Robert and his twin brother Julian had mesmerized her since she was a young girl. They had visited her Puritan father's black shop since she was a child, as did everyone in the surrounding area. Gentry, merchants, and villagers came and went, yet none ever captured her feelings as the Bradshaw twins. Julian was the more rebellious of the two, pretending to ignore his father's existence and constantly trying to lead Robert towards some misdemeanor. Robert, however, was not always as unwilling as he pretended. Now the gimmal ring she wore on a chain around her neck seemed suddenly a living thing. It was the symbol of their love and indeed her entire future. She had written to Robert the day her mother died, begging him to come back quickly, as a cold fear had settled into her heart when she contemplated life with only her father, who cared for nothing except the advancement of the Puritan army and the defeat of King Charles. However, after rereading it, she was glad she had not posted it. She could not send correspondence like that. It sounded hysterical. He would return soon enough, and they would be married. It was something she had to believe. The children had scuttled away when the family returned to the cottage, and Catherine's father told her not to attempt to use grief as an excuse to avoid her chores. Inwardly disgusted at his lack of emotion regarding his wife's death, Catherine did as she said, willing herself to remember her mother as she was when she was well and strong. Lillian had a short but brilliant career on the stage in London, and it was heard that theatre-goers still remembered her and wished she would return. Catherine had wondered once if her mother would not have been better off in that world, rather than suffering the mean existence she found with Catherine's father. An insurgent Puritan, Blake Trefelner, could be a cruel taskmaker and insisted, as did all Puritans, that anything enjoyable was also sinful, and to be good, one must endure discomfort. He frequently called Catherine's beauty from the devil, and continuously accused her of attempting to use it as a weapon of seduction. She fought the urge to ask him if her mother's beauty was also evil, and if so, why he had married her. But she knew such sarcasm would not be tolerated. Catherine was the second of 5 children, and was born with a tenacious will, but learned from a young age that angering her father was not a wise activity. She often wished they could somehow flee his oppressive home, escape England's civil war, and live in peace across the water in France with her mother's sister Magdalene. Catherine's younger sister Sabrina also lived there, after eloping with a French merchant when she turned 16 that year. When their mother's health declined, however, Catherine put such thoughts from her mind, as she knew Lillian would not survive the journey. Catherine herself had inherited her mother's heart malady, which was made worse by a fever in her youth and the oppressive workload she was forced to bear for most of her 19 years of life. It afflicted her sister Sabrina as well, but the younger ones and Christopher apparently escaped the condition. As she quietly went about her chores, Catherine's thoughts turned again to Robert, and she fervently prayed he would return quickly. Nearly 2 months later, when almost finished with the day's laborious tasks, Catherine thought she heard her name ever so faintly and whirled around, willing that familiar voice to be reality and not a dream. Indeed, it was him, emerging from the shadows almost as a spectre. "Darling, I just heard from Janet when I returned home. Why did you not write me?" "But of course I could not," Catherine answered, as she threw herself into his arms, although I did put a few hysterical lines to paper, which thank God I did not post. I sounded insane. It's been horrible without her, but I can't be sad now that you're here. "Am I enough, sweetheart?" he replied, pulling her close to him. "More than enough. You are the love of my life, my entire world." She stepped back, studying his face as if to make sure he truly stood in front of her. "You are more handsome than ever," she cried. Robert and Julian had indeed inherited stunning good looks from their parents. Where Catherine was fair, with grey eyes and dark blonde hair, the twins' hair was almost black, and they had the olive complexion and superb bone structure of their French mother. This was quite striking when combined with their greenish-blue eyes, and they boasted a tall stature and grace that were every bit the Englishman. "I have no words to describe how I've longed for you." He kissed her passionately, then, and glancing over his shoulder for Blake, pulled her closer toward the wood at the back of the property. "Janet also tells me your father has become violent. I hoped it was merely servants' gossip." Catherine hesitated only slightly, and then said, "No, love, 'tis not a rumour. He becomes worse each day, and has raised his hand to me several times in the last month. Although he's left the children alone thus far." Her face held no particular expression, and her tone was equally emotionless. But Robert understood this as he understood everything about her. "If I stay beyond this, we shall be discovered," he said. "Come to the edge of Fartham's Field tonight as soon as it is dark, and I will bring you to the Manor. We'll leave at dawn to be married." "We plan to be married next month," she replied. "After this? Nay, Cathy, sweetheart, I will not risk leaving you here with that wretch of a father." Obviously, all that held him back even slightly was the influence of Christopher and your mother, and now they are both gone. "I fear he may discover something, and I won't take that risk. I've been prepared for this, so don't fret. All will go well." At the mention of her brother's name, Catherine's face brightened. "I've had a letter from Christopher since the burial," she said excitedly. "He's safe and well. He may even be back soon for a few weeks. Perhaps he will have good news." "I am never the pessimist, love, but there was a battle early this month. It took place on the 2nd of July at Marston Moor. It was a tremendous loss for King Charles. York and the majority of northern England are now under the control of Parliament, and people are beginning to say that the king cannot win. Although Cornwall has had some victories, much of the kingdom is losing to the rebels." Catherine's heart sank. Like others, she had been clinging to the hope that the war would end with King Charles, despite his many errors in judgment, still on the throne. The Royalist army had been fighting the Parliamentarians since 1642, and the great losses were suffered on both sides. It was now 1644, and although some victories were achieved in Cornwall, the king's army had also suffered crippling losses. Robert saw Catherine's troubled expression. "Don't fret, sweetheart. I have spent significant time in France on this last trip, and it will not be impossible to refugee there if the worst happens. However, in this moment, all that matters to me is you." He took both her hands and kissed them, then reluctantly let go, swinging quickly up onto his horse. "Come to the edge of the field as soon as they're all asleep, and I will be there to take you away from this miserable life. I've waited too long as it is." And with that he gave her the dazzling smile she had fallen in love with, and she longed for the moment they would be wed. She watched until he was out of sight, and then turned back to her chores. A long evening of work, followed by hours of prayer at her father's command, awaited her, but at that moment she felt she had the strength of 1,000 horses. She realized she would have to tell Clarissa and Matthew, her younger brother and sister, that she was leaving. Clarissa, who was 13, knew she was to be married, but Matthew, at only 8 years old, had not yet been told. With this sudden elopement, however, things were a bit more complicated. Catherine suspected Robert's reaction would be to insist on an immediate marriage, and she could tell by the resolve with which he had said it that there was no changing his mind. At first she worried about leaving Clarissa and Matthew, yet it seemed that most of her father's rages of late concerned Catherine rather than the younger ones. Therefore she felt confident that they would be all right, if not perhaps better, without her for a while. Although Blake had worked with fervor to support the 1642 uprising against King Charles, his children and late wife were secretly and vehemently against the Puritan movement. His son Christopher, unknown to Blake, was working as an unofficial spy for the Royalists, but he was 22 and no longer under his father's iron hand, although he naturally kept his activities secret from the man.